Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Well, they know a thing or two about democracy in Greece, and on Sunday they chose the most radical left-wing government elected in Europe since the 1930s.
And it is the 1930s in Greece, with 50% youth unemployment, mass poverty, a suicide epidemic, fascists on the march, and the state being dismantled on the demand of other states.
The left-wing Syriza party, together with other radical forces, including a party called the River and the Greek communists, who won 32 seats between them, now has a clear mandate and majority for an end to what they call austerity, a 1930s word for making the working people pay for the failures of a system over which they had no control and for which they now refuse to take responsibility.
The other states found it hard to muster much in a way of enthusiasm for the Greek people's verdict. In fact, Herr Juncker, the head of the EU, sent a tweet congratulating the Syriza leader on his election as president, while he's in fact the new prime minister.
Joining us now to survey the scene from the Sputnik is Dr. Vassilis Monastiriotis from the prestigious London School of Economics. Professor, the verdict came as not much of a surprise, though there were some surprising elements. PASOK being reduced to 5%, having once towered over Greek politics for decades. The Golden Dawn, the fascist formation, overtly, explicitly fascist, swastikas and all, becoming the third party in Greece. But Syriza's winning the majority, though just one seat short of a parliamentary majority, wasn't a surprise. Take us through, if you would, your reading of the election result as a whole.
I think there's two elements in the Syriza victory. One is, of course, the appeal of the anti-austerity rhetoric and ideas that have, of course, a huge appeal in Greece. People have been suffering for many years, and they do not see either an end to this austerity program, but also they do not see the fruits of austerity. They do not see there is a stabilization, if you want, of the economy. It is not declining anymore as it has been in previous years, but they do not see the job creation. They do not see the increases in incomes that one would associate, of course, with the end of austerity. So there's very much public support for a change in policy in the direction of ending austerity, and Syriza was the most credible of the parties promising that. I think also there's another element of the dissatisfaction of big parts of the public and of the traditional electorate of the traditional parties of the center left and center right, a dissatisfaction with the way they implemented the policies, the way they communicated the policies, and the way they also engaged in negotiations with the European Union, the Eurozone partners. The policies in Greece have not been near as effective, the austerity policies, near as effective as in other places in southern Europe. They have been painful across the south of the Eurozone, but they have been particularly painful in Greece, partly because of the way they were half implemented and not directed towards essentially supporting growth.
How serious is Syriza, which is a very new party? It has a lot of leftist rhetoric. How serious are they about challenging the orthodoxy of the EU on this matter?
I think overall, Syriza is absolutely serious and committed to challenging some of the main premises of the EU and especially of the Eurozone, of the EMU architecture, how it is built on the idea of fiscal discipline, on the idea of balanced budgets, and of course price stability over full employment as a priority. So they're both committed to challenging that, and they also have an alternative proposal, an alternative vision for a Europe which is more Europe for the peoples rather than Europe for the markets, so to speak. They are a new power in Greek politics, but they're not really a new party. So the party has a long history. Obviously, they come out of the Communist Party historically, but they, in different formations, this political area has been active in Greek politics, both in parliament and also in society. So they have their organizational structure, they have their appeal to particular segments of society, and they know how to take the priorities forward. What they do not have is any experience. The vast majority of them did not have any experience with government, so there's a big uncertainty about how they will handle both governing Greece, the country, but also the negotiations with the Eurozone partners.
Well, I ask because the markets were very calm as a result of their result. You wouldn't have expected that. The new finance minister quickly ruled out any exit from the euro, the so-called Grexit, which really would have set the dominoes tumbling across southern Europe. And the decision to form their formal coalition with the so-called independent Greeks, which did not require any programmatic negotiation of any kind, really just the placing of various personnel in ministries, rather than a negotiation with the River or with the KKE, the Communist Party, which would have required a programmatic dialogue and line-by-line agreement.
Yes. It seems paradoxical, but it was actually easier to form a coalition with the independent Greeks, given the circumstances. Both parties have an absolute priority on anti-austerity and against the memorandum that the Greek governments have signed with the Troika. Politically, they come from very different traditions. Obviously, the independent Greeks are a populist, right-wing party, and with very regressive, you would say, views on migration, on national security, on social rights, gay marriages, and so forth. So it is very paradoxical in that sense that Syriza found them as the coalition partner. But for all practical purposes, what really matters for Greece in the next few months, at least, is a common stance on the issue of austerity and the bailout agreement. And on that, they are indeed in full agreement. They would have a much more difficult task in breaking an agreement either with the Communist Party, who are adamant on their position that Greece should exit the European Union, and this was something that Syriza didn't want to negotiate or to entertain as a thought for a policy proposal, or for the River, the Potami, which is a centre-left, basically, party, newly formed party, and for them, maintaining the country inside the Eurozone and committing to an agenda of structural reforms was an absolute red line. So Syriza would then have to negotiate a very difficult negotiation with the River, the Potami, on what kind of structural reforms and which ones would go in the direction of liberalizing markets, which would go in the direction of perhaps increasing efficiency in the economy, but not making the economy more open to markets. So it came very naturally that the coalition was formed between the independent Greeks and Syriza, and I do not expect to have any sort of frictions or disagreements between them until the issue of austerity and the bailout agreement is resolved one way or another.
Let me ask you about the Golden Dawn. This Europe's most successful, explicitly fascist formation. How did they do? How did they outdo expectation? And what role are they likely to play in this new parliamentary scene?
I think at least in the short run, they will play no role in the parliamentary scene. No party wants to have any kind of relation with them, at least at present. There has been rumors or some evidence that the New Democracy, the previous government party, had links, or some members of it had some links with the Golden Dawn members. At the moment, nobody is associating with them in any way. In any case, the leadership of the party is still in custody, awaiting trial. The party is not illegal. The organization behind the party has been deemed as a criminal organization, and there's a trial partly for that. It must be said that the electoral success of Golden Dawn is not an accident, no matter how much we would like to think that it is an accident. There is support for the views of Golden Dawn, maybe not the most extreme of them, but there is definitely an anti-migrant sentiment. So this goes a long way to explain why 6%
It's a bit odd being both
of,
patriotic and wearing German swastika-type insignias on their arm.
It's not the only paradox with them. Yes, absolutely.
Well, Syriza having won the election spectacularly, do you think this will influence or perhaps empower other left-wing, radical, if you will, far-left parties in the rest of Europe?
I think absolutely yes, and you can see how Podemos reacted and engaged with Syriza in Spain, yes, and how they reacted to the Syriza victory. I think we also see signals to that effect even from Italy and France, where we don't have a radical left, but we have a socialist centre-left governments in both countries, and they were much more positive in relation to the Syriza victory than other governments in other...
The only social democrat who didn't welcome it was Ed Miliband. I hope for his sake that the new Greek government didn't read his response. I've only got a minute or so, a minute and a half. Let me ask you one thing about PASOK. I was once a great admirer of Papandreou, the father, mainly for his foreign policy stands, the Palestinians and so on. His son then became the prime minister. They were a family of some note. PASOK has now, it would appear, plunged into oblivion. Will they ever come back?
It has. It seems extremely unlikely. I wouldn't think that they will be able to come back. They got 4.7% of the vote, and they are facing big challenges ahead in terms of a further split, perhaps. There is a party conference being scheduled quite soon, but I think they have more things that divide them than things that unite them. There is a part of PASOK, of course, that will be perhaps a backbone of a future formation in the centre-left, but I would doubt very much that it would be called PASOK.
Professor, as a tour de horizon, that was a tour de force. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the Sputnik. Coming up after the break, a well-known and controversial former member of the British cabinet, about the most well-known, most controversial British minister of them all, Winston Churchill. Don't miss it. Welcome back to Sputnik. 50 years ago this week, the remains of Sir Winston Churchill were taken by barge from the British Parliament down the Thames, with every crane along the river bowing in respect as he passed by.
Mr. Churchill was the only commoner of the 20th century allowed to lie in state in the Palace of Westminster upon his demise. He had been a member of the House of Commons for 64 years.
The Right Honourable Andrew Mitchell MP, like Churchill, is a Tory, though like him, a surprisingly undoctrinaire one. He's a former cabinet minister with responsibility for international development, and he joins us now. But before he speaks, Gayatri, red gloves and all, asked the London public what they thought of Winston Churchill.
He was a great talker and a very powerful leader, and did a lot for our country in retrospect. Whether people like it or not, he still helped this country in a massive way.
Yeah, I think he was a great British man. He was a good leader of his time. Misunderstood, I think, in his youth, and then he came good when he needed to.
Well, he was an amazing man. He did amazing things. And he was very brave, made brave decisions at an important time.
He won the war for Britain. Well, he was the leader at the time for World War II. Yeah, he did a good job.
Andrew Mitchell, unanimous there, and that doesn't surprise me. But what does surprise me is the deluge of negativity we got about Churchill on the Twitter sphere, which just goes to show how out of touch some people can be, some people especially on the left. Because the truth is, if not for Winston Churchill, if he had not become Prime Minister in 1940, you and I would have been conducting this interview in German, if indeed we were alive to conduct it. Isn't that the case?
Yes, I mean, he had a curiously up and down career. I've just been reading Boris Johnson's appreciation of Winston Churchill on the 50th anniversary. It's interesting the extent to which he got some of the things wrong that he did, but he was the right man in the right place at the right time. In 1939-40, he'd been warning about what was going to happen with extraordinary perceptiveness. And come 1940, came the right man at an incredibly difficult time, as a result of which we're not speaking German, as you said.
And in the Boris Johnson book, which is quite a fine piece of work, even though it's Boris channeling Churchill through himself as a potential leader of the Conservative Party, it is salutary to remind ourselves, as the book does, as some other books carefully omit, the strength of the surrender party at the time in the British establishment. And when Mr. Churchill said that not until the last of us is lying on the cabinet floor choking in our own blood will we surrender, he meant it. And the establishment Peace Party knew that he meant it. There were a lot of fifth columnists around at that time.
Well, there was a powerful group. It comes out rather well, actually, in the Boris account. In the early days when he had just become Prime Minister, a very powerful group who were very worried that Britain simply was not going to be able to win. And the power of the arguments of the appeasers was very clear. I think Churchill's genius was to see that there was no deal that was possible and that this was going to be a fight to the death. And it was that clarity of vision and planning and some quite skillful political manoeuvring in the cabinet at the time, which got him out of first gear into second gear, thank goodness.
The left criticism of him focuses on partially a misreading of some important episodes in his life. But he was not a doctrinaire Tory. You could make an argument, I could, that he wasn't really a Tory at all. And indeed, he ratted and re-ratted 4 years as a Conservative Party, crossing the floor to the then Liberals, crossing back to the Conservatives. But actually, yes, with some quite solid progressive reforms to his credit.
Yes, I mean, he had a very strong social conscience. The social reforms to which you refer are hugely to his credit. And as for his positioning in the Tory party, given that he had been a Liberal, it's quite difficult to pin down. But often Tory positioning is quite difficult to pin down. But he did make mistakes. He was wrong about the abdication. He was wrong about India, the Dardanelles campaign. But his extraordinary bravery and the accounts of when he was wounded and when he was hurt and so forth, his extraordinary bravery, his real strong patriotism, and his clarity of vision at certain key moments in his career and in our national life. That's why I suspect in your film you got a cross-section 100% more or less in favour of saluting him as a great, if not the greatest, Englishman. And why I think he goes down in our national pantheon in such a very high and elevated case. At the critical moments, his clarity saved our country.
He was a wordsmith extraordinaire. I mean, he wrote millions upon millions of words, received the Nobel Prize for Literature. But one of the best things he ever wrote, and this something up your street and mine with our mutual interest in Africa and in the Sudan, he fought at the Omdurman, was disgusted by the mass slaughter wrought by the Gatling gun, but even more disgusted by the conduct of those who dug up the Mahdi from the tomb, cut off the head and played football with the skull. Churchill exposed this crime to the British public in the Pall Mall Gazette. He was quite breathtakingly audacious with the pen as well as with the sword.
Yes, which of course in politics is a hugely valuable ability to do that. I've just been reading the biography of Roy Jenkins. There's up for a prize this week. And he had the same remarkable ability to write extremely well, and as well as to get across his political views through the speeches he made.
Well, I retired Roy Jenkins from the House of
You
Commons, and for which he thanked me. He much preferred the red carpets of the House of Lords.
Well, speaking about red carpets, Winston Churchill was always in the House of Commons. Why did he never become a Lord?
Oh, I think you know, there's no former prime ministers, I think, now in the House of Lords, and you know, he stayed to a very great age.
Extraordinary age.
He stayed in the Commons for as long as he possibly could. I think that when he left the Commons, that was him leaving from Westminster. It was clearly the right decision.
I was just going to make the point about Roy Jenkins. Jenkins began his tremendous biography of Churchill not really buying much of the Churchill myth, but by the end, having had to carefully examine all the papers and all the arguments, he wrote at the end of that biography that he considered Churchill the most amazing human being ever to occupy the office of Prime Minister.
Yes, I think most people who have written about Churchill, it comes across in Boris's book as well, come away from a close examination of the original sources with their already elevated respect even further enhanced. And, you know, that's an encouraging thing, because a lot of these biographies paint Winston Churchill warts and all, but that is the invariable conclusion which their biographers reach.
Speaking of painting him warts and all, it's said that Lady Churchill burned Graham Sutherland's portrait of him because although he very generously received it, he apparently hated it. I rather like it. What do you think?
I remember understanding why Lady Churchill didn't like it. But whether that was because she didn't like it as an appreciation of art or didn't like it because her husband didn't appreciate it, history doesn't tell.
We mustn't burn portraits, warts and all. What lesson or what can we draw from Churchill's life now as we look back on it 50 years on after his demise? Clearly, Boris sees something of Churchill in himself, American by extension, a very maverick political stance, posing with the AK-47s in Kurdistan just last week. Is Boris Johnson potentially another Churchill?
Well, history doesn't repeat itself in the same way, thank goodness. And Boris, after all, was asked to write this rather good and splendid biography, Appreciation, after 50 years. He was asked to do it, and I think he set to that task with the same vim and vigour which he sets to everything, and did a very good job.
I'll take that as a yes. I'll take that as Boris Johnson appreciation. OK, we're looking back, Winston Churchill, 50 years on. In a nutshell, was he the greatest of them all?
Well, as Prime Minister, there are other Prime Ministers in the last 150 years who you could say were great and who had extraordinary characteristics and extraordinary virtues. But given the time when Winston Churchill was Prime Minister and the challenge that our country faced, I think that without qualification, he was the greatest occupant ever of number 10.
Andrew Mitchell, great to see you again. Thanks very much for coming on the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Okay, comments on the Greece result include Max Waite saying they had no money before and now they have none. But they do have self-determination, freedom, respect and solidarity. That's a lot more than they had before. Well done. Naim Riaz Kazi instead says it will be the same as Obama's election slogan, yes we can. His Nobel Peace Prize, and we all know the rest of history. Bit of the...
There is just a little bit of the Barack Obama about the Syriza leader, but I don't want to be too unkind.
On Churchill, we received a lot of hostility and filthy comments.
It was like hate mail now. It was a deluge of hate mail.
Yeah. Well, Zainab Kamal says Churchill was the Bush of his time, racist aristocrat. Alison Dunn sums it up, saying all powerful leaders have unpalatable flaws. Churchill will be chiefly remembered, however, for being a lone voice denouncing the Nazis in the early 30s and insisting on war when appetite for war so soon after the first was so low. He rallied Europe against a significant evil. Whether he was a fat drunk or not hardly matters in this life.
Well, he was fat, he drank, and he smoked, he chain-smoked Havana cigars, and he lived till he was 90.
And that's all that we've got time for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
You can stay in touch with us on Twitter on RT_Sputnik and on Facebook on Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.